In this video on the Civil War, we will look at the election of 1864 and the conclusion of the Civil War and the campaign of 1865. Last time we talked about the victory of Grant in his overland campaign, marching toward a siege of Richmond by sieging Petersburg, cutting off Lee to the south. It stood in stark contrast to McClellan, who retreated after effectively seven victories in 7 days. Grant effectively lost virtually all of these attacking battles, and yet continued to push on. They laid siege to Richmond starting in the late summer, fall of 1864, and for 10 months there's a 20-mile stretch of siege trench warfare that stretches on from the river, from the sea virtually, all around Petersburg, as the lines already extended up to the north, and now Grant continued to extend them as far as he could, forcing Lee to stretch his lines further and further. We also talked last time about Sherman opposing Joe Johnston in their march from Chattanooga, Tennessee, to one of the last major manufacturing centers, warehouse centers, and rail hubs of the Confederacy, Atlanta. And he fought a series of relatively bloodless flanking maneuvers. Unlike Lee, who refused to be flanked, he would fight a fierce battle and then retreat. Joe Johnston would retreat before the battle could really be fought. And in doing so, he conserved his men's lives and his army's battle ability. But the Confederate command believed he was surrendering land too easily. And so he was actually replaced by John Bell Hood, who had a reputation of being a more aggressive general. But Sherman lays siege to Atlanta in much the same way that Grant had bogged down at Petersburg outside Atlanta. And the situation stayed that way all summer. There are months and months of trench warfare, but eventually the Confederates tried to break out with an attack. They fail, and they evacuate and abandon Atlanta rather than have it overrun by force or starved into submission. And this fall of Atlanta, about a month before the election, is one of the key things that boosts Lincoln's popularity and boosts a sense in the North that the Union will win the war. If you thought he was gone for good, General George McClellan is back once more in a major way as the Democratic nominee for president, running against Lincoln. And McClellan announces a peace platform of negotiating with the Confederacy. And what happens is it's almost the week of the fall of Atlanta, which now, to sign a negotiated peace with the South after the fall of Atlanta, seems very foolish. And while the Electoral College vote is pretty lopsided and Lincoln seems to win a landslide, if you look more closely at the popular vote, you'll realize McClellan gets, over 40% of the vote. A meaningful number of people vote for McClellan. And had Atlanta not fallen, or had things broken a slightly different way, it's very conceivable that McClellan may have won this election. So this is a very shocking thing, that the country holds a free election in the middle of a civil war, which is quite remarkable. What does Lincoln stand for in this election? He stands for finishing the war. He stands for emancipation and backing the Emancipation Proclamation and not going back on his word, and he is supported by the fall of Atlanta. McClellan stands for peace, a negotiated settlement, and going back to that original proposition that Lincoln and the Republicans, almost all of them, stood for just 4 years ago, which was leaving slavery alone in the southern states. In the end, Lincoln wins, and in the Electoral College, it's a landslide, and it's followed by large Republican majorities in the House and the Senate as well. And the timely fall of Atlanta gets much of the credit for that. After Atlanta falls, Sherman does not let up. He pushes on deeper through Georgia, heading for the ocean. And the Confederates had been trying to stall Union attacks by hitting their supply lines, by denying them the ability to bring their supplies with them, blowing up bridges, collapsing tunnels through the mountains, destroying railroads. And so Sherman says we'll live off the land. We will plunder the countryside, and we will destroy Confederate homes, towns, villages, railroads. And they burn Atlanta behind them, and they head off toward Savannah. On his march to the sea, they heat up railroad, the metal from railroads, and they bend them up so they're unusable. They tear up and destroy anything that they can't use. The Confederates, again, they lack a powerful enough army to challenge Sherman directly, so they advance into Tennessee with some of their main forces to distract Sherman. But again, the Union forces so outnumber the Confederates that Sherman has a massive 100,000-man army the Confederates can't even oppose, and they have, more modest, 30, 40,000-man armies that are holding Tennessee, such as under General Thomas. And so John Bell Hood launches an attack into Tennessee, fails, and he's actually replaced again by General Joe Johnston, featured here. And in the meantime, Sherman is pressing on in large columns, unopposed, burning a whole swath of Georgia from Atlanta to Savannah, and then pushes into South Carolina, seizing both the capital, Columbia, and the hotbed, the home of the secession of the South, Charleston. Meanwhile, back in the east, the siege of Petersburg lingers on and on. They tried many things to break the line. You'll see more of this in the Ken Burns film. But ultimately, as the line stretched across, Grant's men break through Lee's line at Petersburg in 3 places, and it forces Lee to abandon Richmond. And his army, dwindling now that they're out of their trenches, has dwindled down to 25,000 men, opposed by 125,000 well-equipped, well-fed Union men. And they pursue them from Petersburg to Appomattox Courthouse, where Lee asks Grant for terms and is given generous terms that the men can simply go home. And Lee had thought he would be General Grant's prisoner, and that was not the case, and they were permitted effectively to go home. This results in the surrender of this main army. A couple of weeks later, General Johnston would also surrender to General Sherman up here in North Carolina. Jefferson Davis will make his escape from Richmond down south. He'll be captured and imprisoned. He's one of the few Southerners to really suffer any kind of long-term imprisonment. It was Jefferson Davis alone. There was calls for others to be punished. After the capture of Richmond, but before the war ends, Lincoln had a chance to go visit Richmond, and he walked the streets, and he was thronged by African Americans. Many of the black inhabitants of Richmond hailed him, and they hearkened as if he was Moses from the Old Testament, coming to liberate the Hebrews from the Egyptians. And they hailed him as a conqueror, as a hero, and he was beginning to really get that reputation as a more popular, much more popular than he was when emancipation was declared, much more popular than when the war was going on, and the bloody attacks, particularly Grant's Overland campaign, were costing so many lives. And shortly thereafter, he returns to Washington to view a play, and General Grant was supposed to go with him. And a group of conspirators, this is all happening at the same time in April of 1865. This is all very action-packed. The fall of Richmond, the surrender at Appomattox is all happening. He's just given his second inaugural address, which was, in March. And on Good Friday in April of 1865, he goes to see a play. And there was a plot to assassinate him and Grant and Vice President Johnson and Secretary of State Seward. The man who was to assassinate Johnston panicked and got drunk instead that night. The man who was to assassinate Seward, knocked on his door. Seward answered the door. Seward was stabbed, and they feared for a time he may die, but he was not stabbed badly enough. The man quickly stabbed him, kind of panicked, and ran away. and so Seward was badly wounded but made a full recovery. Grant was supposed to go with Lincoln to see the play that night, but at the last minute had some cause to go be with his family, I believe, and begged off and did not go, and instead another like a colonel, I think, went with Lincoln and sat in the box with him. And John Wilkes Booth snuck into Lincoln. He was an actor and well known at that theater, so nobody had any reason to suspect him when he was, lurking around the theater. He knew most of the people there, the stagehands and things, and was able to get into the president's box without any concern. And he had a small pistol, and he approached Lincoln from behind while they were watching the play, and he shot him in the back of the head. He leapt from the balcony and kind of caught the spur on his boot because he had a horse ready that he was going to ride to try to get away, and the spur of his boot caught on a banner hanging from that balcony, and it caused him to break his leg when he landed on the stage. And he shouted from the stage something along the lines of, "Sic semper tyrannis, death to tyrants, thus may it be to tyrants," and then he limped off the stage. And people realized that Lincoln had been shot badly in the head from behind. He was taken to a building nearby and treated by a doctor, and he continued his heart continued to pump and his lungs to respire for many hours into the night, when he was pronounced dead early in the morning that next day. Between all of these things, the death toll, the money lost, the resistance to preserving slavery rather than preserving the country, and then this last insult, the murder of a president, the first president to be murdered or assassinated, all of these things will build and will be reasons that Northerners, as we say, put on hold racism to a large degree, and the Union really pushes a sort of resentment toward the South and a sense that the South is trying to pretend the war didn't happen and get back to the way things were and put slavery back into place. And so what will happen are large radical Republican majorities and a strong will among Northerners, now that the war is over, to really punish the South for all of these sins, and to really make them howl and pay and do many things that are in the interest of the freed people. Right? African Americans in the South are going to get many benefits, approximate, in the direction of equality and freedom, of course, but even in the direction of equality. And things are amended into the Constitution that will be temporarily and imperfectly in place in the 1860s. Things that within 10 years, Northerners will effectively forgive the South and begin to move on. And the old racial attitudes will reassert themselves as deep-seated and strong. And things that were seemingly promised or granted equality-wise among white and blacks in the South and in the whole country, really, were not really realized in the 1860s and are still quite far off by the 1960s, which was a major theme that we started this unit on. Next time we'll pick up with an introduction to Reconstruction. Thanks for watching.